developmental trauma disorder, so that's the one that is proposed for children and adolescents. They're really talking about adolescents and children that are exposed to chronic trauma or have had multiple exposures. Or what they call in here more adverse, developmentally adverse interpersonal trauma. So what they're saying here is that you could have, if you can think of a child that has had a 2 or 3 traumatic events, you wouldn't say they're the constant traumatic event, but the child, it has had an impact on their capacity to develop. For example, the caretaker hasn't been able to help them regulate their emotions in the face of a traumatic event, either because themselves they didn't have the capacity, for example. You could still have something that adversely impacts on their development. So they're trying to really cover any kind of interpersonal trauma that's going to change how you cope with the world and have an impact on your developmental kind of milestones.
Would an example of that be witnessing family violence?
Yep, I mean that would be, and often with domestic family violence, for example, if you witness your mum being abused, often it tends to be chronic anyway. But there may be a couple of incidents particularly that are traumatic as part of that are not dealt with.
And if there were incidences before the child was an age of being able to remember this disorder wouldn't apply? So
They're not precise enough to tell you that at the moment. So they're talking about, they're not differentiating between whether you remember it or not. That's a whole other can of worms. We could have a whole session on that one. So it's, yeah, but they're talking more about the events that they can tell you about. That's what you're dealing with here. And what they're looking at is dysregulation, really, that this disorder is about dysregulation of cognition, of affect, of behavior, so the whole range. An inability to regulate your emotions. When I talk to people about affect regulation or regulating emotion, I get a whole range of definition about what regulation means. What does affect regulation or emotional regulation mean? I think it's very important to be very clear about that. And if you look at the research, they look at 3 things. They look at ability to actually recognize or name emotions as one. Can I actually name them, feel them? The other thing is that can I actually tolerate emotion? So can I sit with them? Sit with the emotions? And then can I titrate the emotions? Can I help make them go up and down for me? Can I lower the intensity of the emotion? Can I up the intensity of the emotion? And you need all of those 3 aspects to be impacted upon to talk about affect dysregulation.
So why would an adult not be diagnosed with this disorder?
Well, DESNOS is going to look exactly the same. That's what I'll show you in a minute. You know, it's very similar. Yeah, because you do have that in adults as well. If you're talking about behavioral regulation, it's the same thing. It's about being able to name the behavior. It's about being able to regulate the behavior up and down. So they're looking at all those aspects. And the thing that they focus on most in that disorder, I think, is relational regulation. Again, that they're saying you're looking at a disorder that has to do with the interpersonal space and your ability to regulate yourself in relationship to other people. Because often the trauma is interpersonal in nature, or if it's not interpersonal in nature, something is happening in your interpersonal space with your parents, with your carers, that stops you from managing or regulating your emotions in the face of the trauma. Yeah, that someone is not helping you thinking through it. So again, we're not looking at a child that's burned their hands severely, for example, and is severely traumatized by that, and may develop PTSD as a result, but they have a parent that works them through it. So they still might have the nightmares, the experiencing symptoms, the re-experiencing symptoms, the avoidance, and look like they have PTSD. But that's very different from this picture. That's more about the interpersonal space being disrupted and you not meeting your interpersonal developmental goals. You don't learn about how you relate to other people. You don't learn about boundaries very well. You feel overwhelmed with emotions, and that affects how you deal with others, etc.
Is there any sort of, is attachment theory informing that as well?
It is, absolutely. Yeah. So, and we'll talk about that in a minute in the context of Desnos, which looks very similar. So Desnos, the disorder of extreme stress not otherwise specified. The criterion A, if you like, for Desnos, of why you would get Desnos, looks very similar to the developmental trauma criteria, and it is that you have had to have multiple traumas, repeated traumas. You're much likely to have that presentation if it's interpersonal trauma. So you wouldn't get Desnos even if you had been through, I'm trying to think, several natural disasters, for example. You're not likely to develop Desnos. It has to be interpersonal in nature. And you're more likely to develop it if it's happened while you were developing as a child. Having said that, developmental trauma, most people tend to think about someone between the age of 0 to 18, 19, maybe 20. Would that be your thoughts? Now, if you're looking, for example, at the military population, just as an example, where you have a lot of 18 to, say, 22, 23 years old, going through military training, going through big changes in their life, there would be an argument for, well, if something happens to them in a repeated manner at that time of their life, would you consider that developmental trauma? They're still forming their identity. Particularly, I'm sorry to the very few men in the room, but particularly if you're a male, your identity development takes longer. They often look at developmental studies reaching up to the age of 25. And my apologies, but that tends to be the studies. So, we need to be very careful when you assess a trauma, what developmental trauma means, because you could have someone that is in a war situation that's still developing an identity, still learning to regulate their emotions at that age. So, you're looking at other things too that are deeply interpersonal in nature. So if you have someone that has been incarcerated over a number of years, you're looking at probably Desnos. Domestic violence. So if you've been in a domestic violence situation for years and years, you might be looking at Desnos. Torture. Again, you're probably looking at Desnos as well.